I'm not a fan of zoos. I did a video on how zoos are animal prisons, but even I was very affected by the video that went super viral where you see Punch is being hazed by an older monkey. He's being integrated back into the troop after being raised by zookeepers for the past 6 months since he was rejected by his mother during a heat wave at the zoo that he's in, which is right outside of Tokyo. And he's been having trouble integrating back into the troop. He will be integrated back into the troop. However, I do think that the trauma of having been rejected by his mother, I think that's something that he'll probably carry with him for a long time. But you see this image of him being hazed by this older monkey, and then he's screaming and he races back to this plush orangutan stuffed animal from IKEA that is the only comfort that he knows, and that was given to him by the zookeepers to act as kind of like a surrogate mother. And I think one of the most upsetting things about seeing this footage is that we know that this stuffed orangutan, being an inanimate object, can't give him the love and nurturing and protection that he actually needs. So it's a very heartrending and I think very emotionally evocative video. And I think like only people who have hearts of stone would be unmoved by seeing that. I think it's something that a lot of us can relate to, because at moments in our lives when we were children, for instance, there were times when a lot of us were vulnerable and we didn't have the love and protection and nurturing that we needed. And even as adults, sometimes you get hostility and aggression directed at you and you're like, ugh. And you feel a need to kind of hide or, crawl into bed and pull the covers over your head. And I think part of that is because we live in a very violent and dysfunctional world, which I'll come back to. So a lot of us can relate to the plight of Punch, and I think it's also a reflection of the fact that we're a very compassionate species deep down. We have mirror neurons in our brain, which means that when we see suffering, a part of us experiences that suffering. And so we're a compassionate species. We don't like to see suffering. And that's one of the reasons why people really don't want to look at the reality of where their food comes from and see the slaughterhouse footage, the footage of factory farms, because they know that if they really knew the reality of what happens to the animals whose flesh and secretions they're consuming, then they're not going to be able to enjoy them in the same way, and they'll feel compelled to change, and they don't want to change. So a big part of veganism is making the connection that when you go into a supermarket, you don't just see the hamburgers and steak and bacon and cartons of milk and yogurt and ice cream and packages of cheese. You see the animals and you see their suffering. But most people, they don't want to confront that reality, so they push it down and they don't seek out that information. And that information is actually deliberately hidden from them and concealed, because the companies that are producing animal products, they know that if people make that connection, then they won't be as willing to buy their products. So it's deliberately kept out of sight and out of mind. What I want to talk about mostly in this video is the idea of seeing without really seeing. Seeing things, but our gaze is like very superficial and not penetrating and not really understanding the reality of the situation. When I was shooting the B-roll for my zoo video, which was at the Central Park Zoo And that's the zoo that I primarily went to growing up because I'm a native New Yorker. My partner and I, when we went to the Central Park Zoo, we were going there with a very different intention and a very different lens than the other people who were going there. So they were going there to see the animals, to kind of have an outing, something to do, to be entertained. And we were going there to make this video where he's criticizing zoos and also to bear witness to what the animals were going through and to see and understand things from their perspective, which I don't think is something, I think it's something that's really discouraged in our society, to think about things from animals' perspectives. When I was a child, I remember going to the zoo, and I don't know exactly if this was the Central Park Zoo or it might have been the Bronx Zoo. So I remember going into this room and there were these monkeys on display, and it was almost like an exhibit at the Museum of Natural History. If you've ever been there or heard about it, where they have these statues of these prehistoric humans. And the only difference was that these were living, sentient beings, living, breathing, sentient beings, and they were trapped there. And I kind of did a double take, and I was like, wait, what am I looking at here exactly? Like, are these monkeys that are living and breathing, they're actually trapped here in this artificial environment, in this exhibit, or they're trapped in a museum exhibit. And I was momentarily horrified, and I was just like, wait, like, this is so fracked up, you know? And I was like looking around and kind of looking to see if other people had the same reaction that I did. But everyone else was kind of blasé about it. So I pushed it down and I kind of like shrugged it off, and I went into the next room. And how many instances do we have like that when we're kids and we see something that's wrong, that intuitively we know is wrong, and then we push it down because it's considered normal culturally. Last summer, when my partner and I were in Japan, we spent a few days in Nagoya. Nagoya is one of the major Japanese cities, and there's not like a whole lot to do there. One of the things that the highlights that they recommend going to is the zoo. And initially I was like, you know, fucking zoos, like trying to ignore it, trying to just like pretend that it wasn't there and figure something else to do. But then I thought about it, I was like, well, why don't we lean into this? Because we have some downtime. Why don't we go and like bear witness to what the animals are going through? And so we went to the zoo, and it was this swelteringly hot day. This was the end of August, so it was really, really hot. It was in the 90s, but it felt much higher with the humidity. And some of the animals it really seemed like they were dying. And the penguins in particular, it seemed like they were at death's door. And my partner pointed out that the seals were all kind of gathered in this one little area of the pool where there was kind of like a bridge that was providing some cover from the sun. And so the water was, you know, marginally cooler there, and they were all huddled in there, and they were clearly suffering and struggling. And the polar bear was struggling as well. Like, all the animals looked miserable. And again, it was like people were seeing but not really seeing. They weren't really seeing the reality, and they weren't considering things from the animal's perspective. There's a really good article from the New York Times. It's an op-ed, Are Zoos Worth the Moral Cost? And the author talks about this book that she read. It's basically these stories of animals trying to escape zoos or trying to escape captivity. No animal wants to be in captivity. All animals want to be free, and we really don't have the right to take them from their natural habitats. Even if we are destroying their natural habitats, we don't have the right to take them from there and to put them in captivity, because I really believe that there's nothing worse than being in confinement your entire life. So getting back to the Central Park Zoo, around the time that I was born, the Central Park Zoo was undergoing these major renovations because prior to that, the animals had been kept in cages. So the reality of their captivity was really more in your face. And what they did was they created these more naturalistic settings to create the illusion that these animals weren't in captivity, that they were in something that was somewhat analogous to their natural environment. And I think in some ways that's more insidious because it's not in your face. Then people don't make the connection that these animals are imprisoned, that they're trapped. So you might go to a zoo and see the animals in these tiny cages and unable to move around. And you're like, wow, it's a bummer. You see the zoo for what it is, which is an animal prison. But if they create this facade that portrays the zoo as being a good environment for the animals, then it can be more challenging to make that connection. So there are some questions that we should be asking ourselves when we see this footage of Punch. We should be asking ourselves, why is he in this zoo? Why is he trapped in this enclosure? What is a zoo? Why do zoos exist? What are the psychological effects of being trapped in that sort of environment? Why did Punch's mother reject him? Is that normal behavior for macaque monkeys? And in what ways are we contributing to bringing a similar kind of suffering into the world? So why is it that we're not asking these questions and we're not making the connection? I'm going to read a quote from this book, The World Peace Diet by Dr. Will Tuttle. It's the most important book I've ever read. The more forcefully we ignore something, the more power it has over us, and the more strongly it influences us. Looking undistractedly into the animal-derived foods produced by modern methods, we inescapably find misery, cruelty, and exploitation. We therefore avoid looking deeply at our food if it is of animal origin. And this practice of avoidance and denial applied to eating, our most basic activity and vital ritual, carries over automatically into our entire public and private life. We know deep down that we cannot look deeply anywhere, for if we do, we will have to look deeply into the enormous suffering our food choices directly cause. So we learn to stay shallow and to be willingly blind to the connections we could see. Otherwise, our remorse and guilt would be too painful to bear. The acknowledged truth would also conflict too strongly with our self-image, causing serious cognitive dissonance and emotional disturbance. We choose to ignore and thus choose to be ignorant and inattentive. Being unwilling and unable to see, confront, and take responsibility for the hidden ocean of horror that our most basic activity causes to those who are as sentient and vulnerable as we are, we have split ourselves into a schizophrenia of politeness and civility that lives uneasily with the remorseless cruelty that surfaces whenever we obtain or eat animal foods. So a lot of people who have been captivated by Punch's story, they're paying for animals to live miserable existences in confinement and then to be slaughtered at a very young age. They're actually mostly children in terms of what their natural lifespan would be if they were to live in the wild. And a lot of them are separated from their mothers, as in the case of calves in the dairy industry, because cows only lactate for their young, so they're forcibly impregnated, and then they have their calves taken from them so that we can consume their milk. In the egg industry, day-old male chicks are killed. They're either macerated or suffocated, and that's because they're useless to the egg industry. because they don't produce eggs. Collectively, we're participating in bringing a lot of suffering into this world of innocent, vulnerable beings. And I think if people really made the connection of where these products came from, then they might be more willing to bring their choices and their behavior into alignment with their values. Another thing to consider are animals that are being used in research. So this isn't something that we really have much of a dialogue about in our society, but there are millions and millions of animals that are trapped in research facilities, in barren cages, and then intermittently someone comes along and takes them out, performs some sort of cruel experiment or procedure on them. And that's their life, which if we were really to consider things from their perspective would be like a total nightmare, right? And there are a lot of primates that have been used in research, particularly macaque monkeys that are just like Punch. And so if we care about Punch and we care about his plight, we should consider what research facilities have been doing to innocent, vulnerable monkeys like Punch. And this is something that's totally considered normal and culturally sanctioned. Finally, some people have been pointing out the hypocrisy of people who have been losing their shit over Punch, but really didn't seem to care about what the children of Gaza were going through. And I think that's a valid point. Like, why didn't any of the footage of children being pulled from the rubble, or child amputees, or orphans and children crying at the graves of their mothers, why didn't those clips go mega viral? I do think that there will be a reckoning and that we're going to have to come to terms with the fact that so many Westerners turned a blind eye to the apocalyptic nightmare in Gaza. That being said, a lot of the people who have been calling out this hypocrisy are paying for animals to be horribly abused and to die violent deaths. We take these products into our bodies. They disturb our energy fields, I believe. They contribute to these negative energy fields that surround the earth, morphogenetic fields. And as Tolstoy said, as long as there are slaughterhouses, there will be battlefields. So everyone has blind spots. We tend to be compassionate when it's convenient for us, and it suits the paradigms through which we see the world. So we do have the ability to shut down our sense of compassion and turn a blind eye to suffering. That's what selective compassion is. And we reinforce selective compassion 3 times a day through our food choices. I think that if we really want to live in a peaceful society that isn't so violent and isn't so dysfunctional, where we're not carrying around this trauma, then we really have to take a look at what we're doing to the animals and bring our behavior and our choices into alignment with who we really are, which I think deep down we're compassionate beings. And I think that compassion is the most noble attribute that we have. And it's something that we should cultivate. It's something that we should amplify. And I think if we really work on being consistently compassionate towards all sentient beings, then we can bring ourselves into alignment with what our full potential is as a species.